In December 1986, McDonnell Douglas unveiled the MD-11 with 52 firm orders from major global carriers: American Airlines, Delta, Singapore Airlines. Everyone wanted one. But just 5 years later, American Airlines did something almost unheard of in commercial aviation. They retired their entire MD-11 fleet. Delta followed, then Singapore Airlines. And here's the part that, honestly, kind of defies logic. While passenger airlines were urgently trying to offload these jets, FedEx and UPS were buying them as quickly as they became available. FedEx purchased the entire American Airlines MD-11 fleet, and UPS soon invested $2 billion into an aircraft passenger carriers called a headache. Today, more than 35 years after the MD-11 first entered service, both FedEx and UPS continue to operate them. Not only are the jets still flying, but their retirement dates are being pushed further into the future. Even after a crash earlier this year that temporarily grounded the entire fleet and triggered emergency inspections, FedEx extended their MD-11 retirement target from 2028 to 2032. UPS hasn't announced a retirement date at all. So why are UPS and FedEx still flying these 35-year-old fuel-hungry MD-11s when newer, far more efficient alternatives exist? To understand how the MD-11 became a cargo powerhouse, we first need to understand why it failed with passenger airlines. The story begins back in December 1986 when McDonnell Douglas formally launched the MD-11 program with optimism and high expectations. The aircraft was marketed as a stretched, modern successor to the DC-10, keeping the iconic three-engine layout but adding major technological upgrades. It featured a longer fuselage for more passengers and cargo, an advanced glass cockpit that brought it into the digital age, and improved engines that promised better efficiency. On paper, it looked like the perfect next-generation jet for the 1990s. McDonnell Douglas sold the MD-11 as a long-range, fuel-efficient replacement for aging DC-10s, one that could compete with upcoming twin-engine designs like Boeing's 777, still under development at the time. Airlines were enthusiastic. The MD-11 secured 52 firm orders and 40 options from 10 major carriers, including American, Delta, and Singapore Airlines. For McDonnell Douglas, it seemed to prove that three-engine widebodies still had a viable future. But as soon as the MD-11 entered service, the excitement evaporated. Airlines quickly discovered a concerning gap between the aircraft's promised capabilities and its real-world performance. The biggest complaints involved two essential metrics: fuel burn and range. The MD-11 consumed more fuel than expected and, more critically, failed to meet the advertised range figures McDonnell Douglas had guaranteed. American and Delta, two of the largest customers, publicly shared their frustration. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were operational failures that affected route planning and profitability. Both carriers felt they had been promised one aircraft, but delivered a less capable one. The disappointment was so severe that both airlines canceled parts of their MD-11 orders and instead turned to Boeing's 777. For carriers that had already designed their long-term fleet plans around the MD-11, this was an expensive and embarrassing reversal. Under pressure from angry customers and growing criticism, McDonnell Douglas initiated a performance improvement program in the early 1990s. This included aerodynamic changes, engine enhancements, and weight reduction efforts. While the upgrades did help, they never fully bridged the gap between marketing claims and operational reality. The MD-11 remained an aircraft that simply couldn't deliver what airlines had been promised. On top of the performance issues, the MD-11 carried another serious disadvantage: maintenance complexity. Its tail-mounted No. 2 engine, although helpful for aerodynamics, was far more difficult to access than underwing engines on twin jets. Maintenance took longer, required more specialized expertise, and increased operational costs. Even more troubling, the MD-11 inherited a known vulnerability from the DC-10 fragile engine pylon attachment points. These mounts were prone to damage during maintenance due to tight clearances and heavy stress loads. This flaw had already been linked to the tragic crash of American Airlines Flight 191 in 1979, the deadliest aviation accident on U.S. soil. And echoes of the issue resurfaced as recently as the UPS Flight 2976 accident, where the left engine detached shortly after takeoff. According to the NTSB's preliminary investigation, fatigue cracks were found in parts of the pylon. While the MD-11 struggled to satisfy airlines, the competitive landscape shifted. ETOPS regulations, which allowed twin-engine aircraft to operate long-distance routes previously restricted to 3- and 4-engine aircraft, began to mature. With ETOPS extensions, new twins like the Boeing 777 and Airbus A330 could fly almost every route the MD-11 was designed for, but with much better efficiency. For airlines operating with thin margins, the economics were decisive. Twin-engine aircraft simply made more financial sense. The consequences for the MD-11 were immediate. Airlines began removing them from passenger service faster than anyone expected. American Airlines retired its entire fleet in 1996 after only 5 years, shockingly short for a wide-body jet typically expected to fly for decades. Other carriers soon followed. By the early 2000s, nearly all MD-11 passenger operations had ended, replaced by more efficient twin-engine models. For a jet that had launched with such lofty expectations, the fall was stunning. But here's where the story flips. What failed in passenger service turned out to be ideal for cargo operators. When airlines dumped their MD-11 fleets, the aircraft were only about 8 years old, incredibly young for wide-bodies built to last 30 to 40 years. With little demand from passenger carriers, prices fell dramatically. The MD-11 became far cheaper than alternatives like Boeing's 747-400F, or later, the 777F. Studies of the freighter market throughout the 2000s showed just how compelling the economics were. Investors in cargo carriers realized they could buy a used MD-11, pay for a full passenger-to-freighter conversion, and still end up spending far less than the cost of a brand-new 747-400F. That created a huge capital advantage at exactly the moment when both FedEx and UPS were rapidly expanding their long-haul cargo networks. FedEx acted first, and with conviction. In 1996, the company purchased 19 MD-11s that American Airlines had just removed from service. This wasn't a cautious trial run. It was a deliberate strategic move. By 1999, UPS announced a $2 billion acquisition plan for 13 MD-11F conversions with options for 22 more. These commitments would shape each company's operations for decades. So, what made the MD-11 especially appealing to cargo carriers was its place in the wide-body ecosystem. It had been built from the start as a long-range wide-body aircraft, and as a freighter it landed in an ideal capacity slot. The MD-11F could haul roughly 85 to 100 metric tons depending on configuration and route. That positioned it perfectly between mid-sized twins like the 767-300F and large jumbos like the 747-400F. For cargo operators, this middle capacity was exactly what many routes demanded. The MD-11 carried far more than a 767-300F, making it suitable for dense long-haul lanes, but without the enormous purchase price and operating burden of the 747. UPS and FedEx, emphasize maximizing payload on long sectors rather than running the extremely high flight frequencies common in passenger service, where small fuel burn differences scale dramatically across thousands of flights. Because cargo airlines fly less frequently, fuel efficiency penalties don't compound the same way, and the range limitations that irritated passenger airlines were nearly irrelevant for freight. Even though the MD-11 never quite hit its advertised long-range numbers, roughly 4,000 nautical miles was more than enough for the core intercontinental routes linking U.S. hubs with major European and Asian destinations, the backbone of global express logistics. Even when Boeing introduced the more efficient 777F in the late 2000s, UPS still preferred the MD-11 for many missions. Yes, the 777F burns less fuel and carries slightly more, but on routes where those advantages didn't justify the significantly higher capital cost, the MD-11 remained the more economical option. Another major advantage for FedEx was fleet commonality. The company already operated one of the world's largest DC-10 fleets and had decades of experience with McDonnell Douglas Tri-J systems. The MD-11 therefore fit naturally into their operation. The cockpit similarities meant pilot transition training was straightforward, reducing costs and making crew scheduling more flexible. Maintenance teams also benefited. While the MD-11 introduced updated systems, its overall architecture was familiar to technicians who had spent years servicing DC-10s. UPS followed a similar playbook, expanding its MD-11 fleet further by ordering 11 additional aircraft in 2005 and doubling down on the infrastructure and expertise it already possessed. Today, both operators continue flying MD-11s that average around 35 years of age, which is honestly remarkably old by modern standards. Recently, scrutiny intensified when the FAA temporarily grounded all MD-11s after the crash of UPS Flight 2976 in Louisville, pending full inspections and required repairs to engine pylons. One might expect this to accelerate retirements, but the opposite happened. FedEx, which had planned to retire its MD-11s by 2028, extended that timeline to 2032. UPS still hasn't announced any definitive retirement schedule. This isn't resistance to modernization, it's a strategic calculation. FedEx CFO John Dietrich has explained that the global supply chain has been under unprecedented strain in recent years. Post-pandemic purchasing patterns disrupted long-established logistics flows. Geopolitical tensions forced reroutings of supply networks, and the ongoing rise of e-commerce continues to elevate demand for international air freight capacity. These strains, coupled with both companies' ambitions to seize larger portions of the profitable global air cargo market, have triggered a reevaluation of fleet strategies. Another key financial factor is depreciation. Most MD-11s at FedEx and UPS are now fully paid off, or nearly so. That means their operating costs are dominated by incremental expenses, fuel, maintenance, crew, rather than massive capital payments. This makes it possible for the companies to squeeze every remaining dollar of value out of the aircraft before replacing them becomes economically compelling. Retirement will come only when new models offer enough margin improvements to justify the enormous investment. The MD-11's trajectory highlights an aviation paradox. What failed dramatically in passenger service found long-term viability in the cargo world. Airlines ditched the MD-11 barely a decade into its life, but cargo carriers discovered that low acquisition costs, adequate range, and operational commonality outweighed its shortcomings. More than 35 years later, FedEx and UPS continue operating these aging Tri-Js, not because they're nostalgic or resistant to change, but because the economics still add up. In an industry obsessed with modernization, the MD-11 stands as proof that the best airplane isn't always the newest or most efficient. It's the one that remains profitable. And as long as these aircraft continue to be cost-effective and reliable, don't expect them to vanish from cargo networks anytime soon.